The glass-walled conference room on the third floor of the Thorn Maritime Group headquarters felt like a different world from the shipyard below. It was cool, quiet, and smelled of new carpet and expensive department store cologne. Outside the window, the sun beat down on 40 acres of concrete, steel, and salt water. I could see the blue flash of welding arcs on the hull of the Thorn Resolve, a 300-foot cargo vessel sitting in the dry dock, and hear the distant, rhythmic clang of crane cables. Inside, Julian Thorn, the 25-year-old grandson of our founder, sat across the mahogany table. He had a degree from a prestigious business school, a slim fit suit with no tie, and white sneakers that had never touched a greasy grating in their life. He hadn't looked up from his laptop screen since I walked in 10 minutes ago. Standing near the door was Linda Cole, the general counsel, holding her tablet like a shield. She wouldn't look at me either. Julian finally glanced up, his eyes stopping somewhere near my collar rather than meeting my gaze. "Silas," he said, his voice flat and rehearsed, "I will get right to the point. Thorn Maritime is transitioning to an asset-light operational model. We are entering into a strategic partnership with Al Maktoum Marine Services for all our fleet maintenance and dry dock operations. This means your position as Director of Marine Operations is being eliminated, effective immediately." He paused, waiting for me to react, perhaps expecting me to shout or plead for my job. I did not move. I did not say a word. He cleared his throat and continued, gesturing vaguely toward the window. "Frankly, Silas, that dry dock down there is a rust bucket. The overhead is astronomical, and maintaining it ourselves is an outdated business practice. Modern fleet operators do not own their maintenance facilities." The human resources representative shifted her weight nervously. Julian slid a separation package across the table. I looked at the papers, then looked out the window at the dry dock. It was a 400-foot deep-water bay capable of handling any ship in our 23-vessel fleet. I had spent the last 22 years of my life maintaining, repairing, and upgrading that facility. I rebuilt the keel blocks myself in 2014, replaced the massive ballast pumps in 2018, and poured the concrete access ramps with my own crew in 2009. Every single ship in the Thorn fleet depended on that facility to remain certified under the Jones Act. "I understand," I said. Just 2 words. Julian's eyebrows twitched. He had expected an argument, a speech about loyalty, or maybe a desperate negotiation. He did not expect a man to calmly stand up, pick up a thick manila folder from the adjacent chair, and walk out of the room without another word. The general counsel stepped aside to let me pass, her face pale. "My name is Silas Vance. I am 52 years old, and I spent 12 years burning rod in every major shipyard along the Gulf Coast before Thorn Maritime hired me. I started as a welder's apprentice at 18, with no formal college education, earning every certification by doing the work better than anyone else. I was hired at 30 because I was the only welder willing to answer a 2 o'clock in the morning call to repair a cracked keel on the Thorn Pioneer, finishing the job by dawn under temporary work lights. Since then, I worked my way up from welder to shift supervisor, then dock superintendent, and finally director of operations. Over 22 years, not a single ship failed a Coast Guard inspection under my supervision. The dry dock had been a rusted ruin when I first laid eyes on it in the mid-2000s after the previous operator went bankrupt. I spent a decade turning it into the premier maintenance yard on this coast. It had a fully stocked warehouse, custom-designed welding stations, and a direct pipeline fuel depot. But the job cost me. I remembered October of last year. My 17-year-old son, Mason, was playing his first varsity football game for Lafourche Parish High. I had the date circled on the calendar in my office for months, but at 3 in the afternoon, the Thorn Endeavor limped into the channel with a serious hull breach. Emergency dry docking was mandatory. My wife Clara, a school nurse, recorded the entire game on her phone, holding it up in the bleachers for 2.5 hours so I could watch Mason score a touchdown on a fumble recovery. I watched that video 9 times in the quiet of my office at midnight, still wearing my greasy coveralls and steel-toed boots. Clara texted me that night, "He looked for you in the stands." I had missed so many milestones, believing the company needed me. Now, the founder's grandson had just fired me, calling my life's work a rust bucket. I walked down the stairs and out into the hot, humid air of the yard. Hank Boyd, my yard foreman, was standing by the gate. Hank is 48 years old, a barrel-chested man with hands like iron, who had worked under me for 16 years. He had texted me the night before, warning me to watch my back. He didn't say anything as I approached. He just nodded, his jaw clenched in anger. I didn't say anything either. I walked to my white Ford F-250, a truck with 214,000 miles on the odometer and rust eating the wheel wells. I placed the manila folder on the passenger seat. Julian Thorne thought he had just discarded an old relic. He had no idea that I owned the ground beneath his feet and that he had just signed the death warrant for his family's empire. I drove home along the winding bayou road, the engine of the truck humming a familiar, steady tune. When I pulled into the driveway, Clara was sitting in the front porch swing, her reading glasses pushed up on her head. She looked at the manila folder in my hand as I climbed the steps. "It is done," I said, sitting down beside my wife. She didn't ask if I was angry or if I was going to fight it. Clara had been my rock since we married at 24, and she knew me better than I knew myself. She simply took my hand. "Otis is ready," she asked. I nodded. "He is drafting the papers now." To understand why I was so calm, you have to go back to 2011. The company that operated the shipyard before us had fallen into bankruptcy. The court ordered a liquidation auction for the entire 40-acre waterfront parcel, which included the 400-foot deep-water dry dock, the repair bays, the parts warehouse, and the fuel depot. I had worked in that yard for years, and I knew its potential. I also knew that if Thorne Maritime didn't lease it, their entire shipping operation on the Gulf Coast would be crippled, as there was no other deep-water bay within 200 miles. She remembered the sleepless nights from 13 years ago when we decided to bid on the property. We had sat at this very kitchen table, staring at the legal notices and calculating the risks. Clara had been the school nurse for Lafourche Parish for a decade, and she knew the value of stability, but she also believed in my hands and my work ethic. We had lived frugally for the first 5 years after buying the yard, skipping vacations and eating simple meals of red beans and rice, ensuring that every penny went toward securing our ownership. I recalled the quiet walks we took along the waterfront, looking at the silent cranes and promising each other that one day this land would belong to our family in full. When the opportunity came, we were ready. I called Otis Barlow, a sharp maritime attorney who had represented local fishermen and dockworkers from his small office in Thibodaux for 3 decades. Otis was 61, a quiet man who kept his files in fireproof cabinets and never raised his voice. I told him I wanted to buy the property. Clara and I sat at our kitchen table and looked at our finances. We had $340,000 in savings, money I had earned from decades of overtime and smart investments. To cover the rest of the bid, we had to take out a second mortgage on our house. It was a massive risk, but Clara didn't hesitate. She signed the papers, and at the auction, Gulf Breeze Holdings LLC, the entity Otis had created with me as the sole managing member, won the property for a final bid of $1,100,000. It was a steal for a facility that had cost $28 million to construct. A month later, Thorne Maritime leased the property from Gulf Breeze Holdings LLC for $92,000 a month. For 13 years, the lease payments arrived on time, processed by an automated system in the accounting department. No one in corporate management ever questioned who owned the LLC. To them, it was just another monthly utility bill. But Otis had inserted a protective clause in the contract. Section 6.4 of the lease agreement stated that if the tenant ever terminated the employment of the managing member or beneficial owner of the landlord entity, the landlord reserved the right to terminate the lease immediately with 14 calendar days written notice. Furthermore, the termination would trigger the penalty provisions of Section 19.6, which mandated an immediate contract breach payment of $11 million, alongside holdover fees of $10,000 per day if they failed to vacate the property. The former chief financial officer of Thorne Maritime, who had since retired, signed the lease without a second thought. For 13 years, the contract lay dormant in a filing cabinet, unread by the new generation of executives who only cared about spreadsheets and cutting costs. I parked my truck near the edge of Bayou Lafourche, watching the brown water slide past the cypress knees. I pulled out my phone and dialed Otis. He answered on the first ring. "Silas," he said. "I heard the news from Hank. Are we moving forward?" "Yes, Otis. Send the notice. I want it delivered to their headquarters today." "Understood. I will have a courier hand deliver it to Linda Cole by 2 in the afternoon. Let the 14-day clock begin." I hung up the phone and poured a cup of coffee from my thermos. Across the bayou, a heron rose from the shallows, its long wings catching the afternoon light. For 13 years, I had kept this secret, paying the property taxes and maintaining the dry dock as an employee, never mentioning my ownership to the board or to the grandfather, Roland Thorne. I had done my job faithfully, but I had also built a safety net. Julian Thorne believed he was streamlining the company by getting rid of an expensive old welder. He was about to find out that the foundation of his entire shipping empire was built on sand, and I was about to pull the plug. At exactly 2:43 in the afternoon, the legal envelope was delivered to the desk of Linda Cole, the general counsel of Thorne Maritime Group. She was 44 years old, a detail-oriented lawyer who had spent her career reviewing maritime contracts. When she opened the envelope and read the letter from Otis Barlow's office, she initially assumed it was a routine landlord-tenant dispute. But as she read the words lease termination and Section 6.4, her brow furrowed. She pulled the physical lease file from the corporate archives, a thick, dusty folder that had not been opened in over a decade. She flipped to the termination clauses and read the text of Section 6.4. Her heart skipped a beat. The clause was clear. If the lessee terminated the employment of the managing member of Gulf Breeze Holdings LLC, the lease could be canceled with 14 calendar days' notice. She quickly opened the Louisiana Secretary of State website and searched for the entity name. When the page loaded, the name of the managing member stared back at her in bold black letters, Silas Vance. Linda sat frozen in her office for a full minute, the hum of the server room the only sound in the quiet space. She realized the immediate catastrophe. Section 19.6 of the lease mandated a penalty of $11 million for early termination caused by a tenant breach, and the company would be required to vacate the 40-acre property, including the dry dock, within 14 days. She immediately called Roland Thorne, the 74-year-old founder of the company, and summoned Julian Thorne to the executive boardroom for an emergency meeting. Julian strolled into the room 40 minutes later, still wearing his Navy suit, looking relaxed and confident. He sat at the head of the table, glancing at the speakerphone where his grandfather's breathing could be heard. "What is the emergency, Linda?" Julian asked, adjusting his cuffs. "We have a legal crisis," Linda said, her voice shaking slightly as she projected the lease document onto the screen. "Yesterday you terminated Silas Vance. By doing so, you triggered Section 6.4 of our dry dock ground lease. The landlord, Gulf Breeze Holdings LLC, has issued a 14-day eviction notice." Julian laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "So what? We pay them $92,000 a month. We will just renegotiate the lease or find another landlord. They cannot just kick us out." "Yes, they can," Linda replied, pointing at the screen. "The landlord is Silas Vance. He owns the 40 acres of waterfront. He owns the dry dock, the warehouse, and the fuel depot. We do not own a single inch of the land our maintenance facility sits on. And because you fired him, he has the legal right to evict us. Furthermore, the contract dictates an $11 million penalty for this breach." Julian's smile faded. His face went pale, his eyes widening as he stared at the screen. "That is impossible. He is a welder. How could a welder own a $28 million facility?" "It doesn't matter how he owns it," Linda snapped. "He bought it at a bankruptcy auction 13 years ago. The lease was signed by the former chief financial officer, and it is fully enforceable." Roland's voice came through the speakerphone, low and trembling with rage. "Julian, did you review the lease before you fired Silas?" Julian swallowed hard, looking at the phone. "No, grandfather. He was just an employee. We were transitioning to an asset-light model with Al Maktoum in Bahrain. We don't need the dry dock." "You idiot," Roland roared through the speaker. "We have 23 vessels operating under the Jones Act. They are required by federal law to undergo regular hull inspections and dry dock maintenance. You cannot sail a ship to Bahrain for a routine inspection. The fuel costs and transit time would ruin us." The nearest certified deepwater dry dock is in Mobile, and they have an 8-month waiting list. If we cannot access Silas's dry dock, our fleet will be grounded, our insurance will be canceled, and we will lose every shipping contract we have." The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. Julian sat paralyzed, his brilliant career plan crumbling into dust. "Leave the room, Julian," Roland said, his voice cold and flat. "But grandfather," "I said leave," the old man growled. Julian stood up slowly, his expensive white sneakers squeaking loudly against the polished hardwood floor. It was a pathetic, childish sound that echoed in the silent room. He walked out, closing the door behind him. Linda Cole began typing on her laptop, calculating the financial ruin. 14 days to move 23 ships, $11 million in immediate penalties, and a complete halt to their Gulf Coast operations. Roland Thorne sat in his home office miles away, staring at the phone, realizing that the welder his grandson had dismissed so arrogantly held the entire fate of Thorne Maritime in his hands. On Friday morning, I sat in the conference room of Otis Barlow's law office in Thibodaux. Across the table sat Gordon Finch, the 60-year-old chief executive officer of Apex Marine Group. Gordon was a legend on the Gulf Coast, a self-made man who had started his career as a deckhand and built Apex into a major shipping competitor. He was wearing a faded polo shirt and had calloused hands, just like mine. We had known each other for years, and he had been trying to recruit me to manage his fleet operations for 3 years. "Silas," Gordon said, looking over the documents Otis had prepared. "I still can't believe Julian Thorne was stupid enough to fire you. He just handed us the keys to the Gulf Coast." Gordon laughed, shaking his head as he signed. He told me that Julian had tried to negotiate a contract with Apex a year ago, showing up in a tailored suit and talking about synergy and digital transformation, but refusing to understand the basic mechanics of harbor towing. Gordon had walked out of that meeting within 15 minutes, realizing the young man was completely out of his depth. "Firing you was the final straw, Silas," Gordon said. "The industry is built on trust and expertise, not on fancy degrees. We are going to build something enduring here." I signed the paperwork, and Gordon did the same. The contract was massive, a 5-year exclusive service agreement worth $47 million. Under the terms, Gulf Breeze Holdings LLC granted Apex Marine Group exclusive rights to the dry dock, repair bays, and warehouse. In addition, I was named Vice President of Fleet Operations for Apex Marine, tasked with overseeing all inspections and maintenance for their growing fleet. But the most important section was Article 3, Paragraph 9, which we called the Non-Service Clause. It explicitly prohibited any vessel owned or operated by Thorne Maritime Group from using the dry dock for the duration of the 5-year agreement. Once the notarized stamps were applied, the deal was official. 10 days after Julian Thorne had told me I would be filing for unemployment, the first Apex Marine vessel entered my yard. The Apex Pioneer, a massive 380-foot container ship, glided into the deepwater bay at dawn. Hank Boyd stood on the concrete dock wall, directing the rigging crew over his radio. The giant ballast pumps began to hum, draining the water from the bay as the ship settled onto the keel blocks I had rebuilt. The dry dock was alive with the sound of grinding metal, the hiss of sandblasters, and the bright blue light of welding torches. We were back to work. At 8:15 the following Thursday morning, a black Lincoln Town car pulled into the gravel parking lot of the shipyard. I watched from the dock wall as Roland Thorne stepped out of the passenger side. He looked frail, his shoulders stooped under the weight of the crisis. He walked slowly across the gravel toward the dry dock, his eyes scanning the busy workers and the massive Apex vessel dominating the bay. I walked down the metal stairs to meet him near the fuel depot. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and salt water. Roland stopped a few feet away, looking at me with a mixture of respect and desperation. "Silas," he said, his voice barely carrying over the sound of the yard. "I fired Julian this morning. The board voted unanimously to remove him. He is gone." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. I had no desire to gloat. Roland had given me my first real break 22 years ago, and I still respected the man who had built the company. "I am sorry to hear that, Mr. Roland," I said. "I am here to ask for a lease, Silas," the old man pleaded, his hands trembling. "Any terms you want, we will pay double the rent. We will pay $92,000 a week if that is what it takes. Just let our ships back in. We have 4 vessels that will lose their Jones Act certification next week. Our insurance is threatening to pull coverage. We are facing ruin." Roland sighed, looking at the ground. He admitted that he had retired too early, leaving the company in the hands of a boy who had never faced a real crisis. Julian was raised in comfort, Roland said, his voice cracking slightly. He never had to work in the sun or feel the weight of a heavy line. He thought business was just a game of numbers on a screen. He didn't understand that the numbers are generated by men like you, Silas. I nodded, acknowledging his pain, but my mind was set. The future belonged to those who respected the craft. I looked at him for a long moment. "I would like to help you, Mr. Roland, but I cannot. I signed an exclusive agreement with Apex Marine 3 days ago. Article 3, Paragraph 9 prevents any Thorn maritime vessel from using this facility." Julian made sure I was completely free to sign that contract when he escorted me out of the building. Roland closed his eyes, his head bowing. He knew the law. He knew that an exclusive maritime service contract could not be easily broken, especially with Apex Marine's legal team backing it. "You were the best hire I ever made, Silas," he whispered. "I am sorry I let my grandson blind me to the value of the men who built this company." He turned and walked slowly back to his car. He did not look back as the Lincoln drove out of the gate and disappeared down the highway. I watched him go, feeling a quiet sense of closure. The man who had dismissed me as a mere welder with a title had lost the crown jewel of his grandfather's empire in a matter of days. The collapse of Thorn Maritime Group was swift and merciless. Within 6 weeks of losing their lease at the dry dock, the operational reality caught up with them. Without access to a certified deepwater maintenance facility, 4 of their largest cargo vessels failed their annual Jones Act inspections. The Coast Guard grounded the ships in port. Within days, their insurance carrier issued a formal coverage gap notice, refusing to insure vessels that could not meet safety regulations. With their fleet crippled, Thorn Maritime could not fulfill its shipping contracts. The grounded vessels sat idle along the canal, their hulls gathering rust and barnacles as the legal notices accumulated in the executive offices. I drove past them occasionally on my way to the yard, seeing the silent engines and the empty decks where active crews should have been working. It was a somber sight, a monument to corporate arrogance. Apex Marine, now operating at full capacity in the dry dock with me overseeing the schedules, stepped in to offer immediate transport services to Thorn's stranded clients. 12 of Thorn's largest shipping accounts defected to Apex Marine within 3 months, representing a loss of $1,200 million in annual revenue. The financial strain was too much for the company to bear. The board of directors forced a corporate sale. The shipping empire that Roland Thorn had spent 50 years building, valued at $1,900 million just a year prior, was sold to a private equity firm for 26 cents on the dollar. The new owners immediately liquidated the remaining assets, selling off the fleet piece by piece. Julian Thorn's career was finished. His social media profiles went dark, his posts about corporate innovation and making tough calls deleted. Last I heard from industry contacts, he was back in New York, trying to secure entry-level interviews at consulting firms, his expensive business degree tarnished by the legendary blunder. 2 months after the sale, I received a handwritten letter in the mail from Roland. The envelope bore the old company logo, the one featuring the tugboat he had drawn himself in 1971. The letter contained only 2 sentences. "You earned every bit of this, Silas. I am deeply sorry I did not see the truth sooner." I read it once, then placed it in the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet next to the original property deed and the old photograph of my father. In total, Gulf Breeze Holdings LLC collected $83 million from the contract breach penalties, the holdover damages, and the new agreement with Apex Marine. Clara and I paid off the second mortgage on our house, clearing the debt in full. We celebrated by sitting on our porch with a bottle of wine, watching the sunset over the bayou, talking about how far we had come from the days when we had to count every penny at the grocery store. I established a college trust fund for Mason, ensuring he could pursue any career he chose, whether he wanted to weld or study science. I also bought Clara a brand new utility vehicle, a quiet thank you for the 13 years she had stood by me without questioning my gamble. She had smiled when I brought it home, admitting she was glad to retire the old family car. Mason was thriving as well, his performance on the football field drawing scouts from several major universities, his future bright and secure. It was a late Friday evening in October, during the warm transition of Indian summer on the Gulf Coast. The sky was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple as the sun sank below the horizon. I sat in the cab of my truck parked at the edge of the dock wall, windows rolled down to let in the warm breeze. Below me, the newly painted hull of an Apex vessel gleamed in the twilight. The yard was quiet now, the workers having finished their shifts. I could hear the faint sound of waves lapping against the concrete pilings and the smell of salt and diesel hanging in the air. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I picked it up to see Mason's name on the screen. "Dad, you coming to the football game tonight?" he asked. I smiled, looking at the keys in the ignition. "I am already in the truck, son. I will be in the front row." I heard him laugh before he hung up. I started the engine, the heavy motor turning over with a familiar rumble. For 22 years, I had worked to build someone else's dream, sacrificing time with my family to keep their ships afloat. In the end, they had tried to discard me like a piece of scrap metal, but the steel I had shaped with my hands remained, while their paper contracts and corporate strategies had burned to ash. I backed the truck out of the parking lot and drove toward the high school stadium, leaving the quiet shipyard behind me, secure in the knowledge that I had finally reclaimed what was mine.